In the confusion of darkness, an assailant may sometimes succeed. But in this great and general attack, the military judgment and astrological knowledge of Mohammed advised him to expect the morning, the memorable 29th of May, in the 1453rd year of the Christian era. The preceding night had been strenuously employed. The troops, the cannon, and the fascines were advanced to the edge of the ditch, which in many parts presented a smooth and level passage to the breach. And his fourscore galleys almost touched, with the prows and their scaling ladders, the less defensible walls of the harbour. Under pain of death, silence was enjoined. But the physical laws of motion and sound are not obedient to discipline or fear. Each individual might suppress his voice and measure his footsteps. But the march and labour of thousands must inevitably produce a strange confusion of dissonant clamours, which reached the ears of the watchmen of the towers. At daybreak, without the customary signal of the morning gun, the Turks assaulted the city by sea and land, and the similitude of a twined or twisted thread has been applied to the closeness and continuity of their line of attack. The foremost ranks consisted of the refuse of the host, a voluntary crowd who fought without order or command, of the feebleness of age or childhood, of peasants and vagrants, and of all who had joined the camp in the blind hope of plunder and martyrdom. The common impulse drove them onwards to the wall. The most audacious to climb were instantly precipitated, and not a dart, not a bullet of the Christians was idly wasted on the accumulated throng. But their strength and ammunition were exhausted in this laborious defence. The ditch was filled with the bodies of the slain. They supported the footsteps of their companions. And of this devoted vanguard, the death was more serviceable than the life. Under their respective bashors and sanjaks, the troops of Anatolia and Romania were successively led to the charge. Their progress was various and doubtful, but after a conflict of 2 hours, the Greeks still maintained and improved their advantage, and the voice of the emperor was heard, encouraging his soldiers to achieve, by a last effort, the deliverance of their country. In that fatal moment, the Janissaries arose, fresh, vigorous, and invincible. The Sultan himself on horseback, with an iron mace in his hand, was the spectator and judge of their valour. He was surrounded by 10,000 of his domestic troops, whom he reserved for the decisive occasion, and the tide of battle was directed and impelled by his voice and eye. His numerous ministers of justice were posted behind the line to urge, to restrain, and to punish. And if danger was in the front, shame and inevitable death were in the rear of the fugitives. The cries of fear and of pain were drowned in the martial music of drums, trumpets, and ataballs, and experience has proved that the mechanical operation of sounds, by quickening the circulation of the blood and spirits, will act on the human machine more forcibly than the eloquence of reason and honour. From the lines, the galleys, and the bridge, the Ottoman artillery thundered on all sides, and the camp and city, the Greeks and the Turks, were involved in a cloud of smoke, which could only be dispelled by the final deliverance or destruction of the Roman Empire. The single combats of the heroes of history or fable amuse our fancy and engage our affections. The skilful evolutions of war may inform the mind and improve a necessary, though pernicious, science. But in the uniform and odious pictures of a general assault, all is blood and horror and confusion. Nor shall I strive, at the distance of 3 centuries and 1,000 miles, to delineate a scene of which there could be no spectators, and of which the actors themselves were incapable of forming any just or adequate idea. The immediate loss of Constantinople may be ascribed to the bullet or arrow which pierced the gauntlet of John Justiniani. The sight of his blood and the exquisite pain appalled the courage of the chief, whose arms and counsels were the firmest rampart of the city. As he withdrew from his station in quest of a surgeon, his flight was perceived and stopped by the indefatigable emperor. "Your wound," exclaimed Palaeologus, "is slight. The danger is pressing. Your presence is necessary. And whither will you retire?" "I will retire," said the trembling Genoese, "by the same road which God has opened to the Turks." And at these words he hastily passed through one of the breaches of the inner wall. By this pusillanimous act he stained the honours of a military life, and the few days which he survived in Galata, or the Isle of Chios, were embittered by his own and the public reproach. His example was imitated by the greatest part of the Latin auxiliaries, and the defence began to slacken when the attack was pressed with redoubled vigour. The number of the Ottomans was 50, perhaps 100 times superior to that of the Christians. The double walls were reduced by the cannon to a heap of ruins. In a circuit of several miles, some places must be found more easy of access or more feebly guarded, and if the besiegers could penetrate in a single point, the whole city was irrecoverably lost. The first who deserved the Sultan's reward was Hassan the Janizary, of gigantic stature and strength. With his scimitar in one hand and his buckler in the other, he ascended the outward fortification. Of the 30 Janizaries who were emulous of his valour, 18 perished in the bold adventure. Hassan and his 12 companions had reached the summit. The giant was precipitated from the rampart. He rose on one knee and was again oppressed by a shower of darts and stones. But his success had proved that the achievement was possible. The walls and towers were instantly covered with a swarm of Turks, and the Greeks, now driven from the vantage ground, were overwhelmed by increasing multitudes. Amidst these multitudes, the emperor, who accomplished all the duties of a general and a soldier, was long seen and finally lost. The nobles who fought round his person sustained till their last breath the honourable names of Palaeologus and Cantacuzene. His mournful exclamation was heard, "Cannot there be found a Christian to cut off my head?" And his last fear was that of falling alive into the hands of the infidels. The prudent despair of Constantine cast away the purple. Amidst the tumult, he fell by an unknown hand, and his body was buried under a mountain of the slain. After his death, resistance and order were no more. The Greeks fled towards the city, and many were pressed and stifled in the narrow pass of the gate of St. Romanus. The victorious Turks rushed through the breaches of the inner wall, and as they advanced into the streets, they were soon joined by their brethren, who had forced the gate Fenar on the side of the harbour. In the first heat of the pursuit, about 2,000 Christians were put to the sword. But avarice soon prevailed over cruelty, and the victors acknowledged that they should immediately have given quarter if the valour of the emperor and his chosen bands had not prepared them for a similar opposition in every part of the capital. It was thus, after a siege of 53 days, that Constantinople, which had defied the power of Chosroes, the Chagan, and the caliphs, was irretrievably subdued by the arms of Mohammed II. Her empire only had been subverted by the Latins. Her religion was trampled in the dust by the Moslem conquerors. The tidings of misfortune fly with a rapid wing, yet such was the extent of Constantinople that the more distant quarters might prolong some moments the happy ignorance of their ruin. But in the general consternation, in the feelings of selfish or social anxiety, in the tumult and thunder of the assault, a sleepless night and morning must have elapsed. Nor can I believe that many Grecian ladies were awakened by the Janizaries from a sound and tranquil slumber. On the assurance of the public calamity, the houses and convents were instantly deserted, and the trembling inhabitants flocked together in the streets like a herd of timid animals, as if accumulated weakness could be productive of strength, or in the vain hope that amid the crowd each individual might be safe and invisible. From every part of the capital they flowed into the church of St. Sophia. In the space of an hour, the sanctuary, the choir, the nave, the upper and lower galleries were filled with the multitudes of fathers and husbands, of women and children, of priests, monks, and religious virgins. The doors were barred on the inside, and they sought protection from the sacred dome, which they had so lately abhorred as a profane and polluted edifice. Their confidence was founded on the prophecy of an enthusiast or impostor that one day the Turks would enter Constantinople and pursue the Romans as far as the column of Constantine in the square before St. Sophia. but that this would be the term of their calamities, that an angel would descend from heaven with a sword in his hand, and would deliver the empire with that celestial weapon to a poor man seated at the foot of the column. "Take this sword," would he say, "and avenge the people of the Lord." At these animating words, the Turks would instantly fly, and the victorious Romans would drive them from the west and from all Anatolia as far as the frontiers of Persia. It is on this occasion that Ducas, with some fancy and much truth, upbraids the discord and obstinacy of the Greeks. "Had that angel appeared," exclaims the historian, "had he offered to exterminate your foes, if you would consent to the union of the church, even then, in that fatal moment, you would have rejected your safety, or have deceived your God." While they expected the descent of the tardy angel, the doors were broken with axes, and as the Turks encountered no resistance, their bloodless hands were employed in selecting and securing the multitude of their prisoners. Youth, beauty, and the appearance of wealth attracted their choice, and the right of property was decided among themselves by a prior seizure, by personal strength, and by the authority of command. In the space of an hour, the male captives were bound with cords, the females with their veils and girdles. The senators were linked with their slaves, the prelates with the porters of the church, and young men of a plebeian class with noble maids whose faces had been invisible to the sun and their nearest kindred. In this common captivity, the ranks of society were confounded. The ties of nature were cut asunder, and the inexorable soldier was careless of the father's groans, the tears of the mother, and the lamentations of the children. The loudest in their wailings were the nuns, who were torn from the altar with naked bosoms, outstretched hands, and dishevelled hair. And we should piously believe that few could be tempted to prefer the vigils of their harem to those of the monastery. Of these unfortunate Greeks, of these domestic animals, whole strings were rudely driven through the streets, and as the conquerors were eager to return for more prey, their trembling pace was quickened with menaces and blows. At the same hour, a similar rapine was exercised in all the churches and monasteries, in all the palaces and habitations of the capital. Nor could any place, however sacred or sequestered, protect the persons or the property of the Greeks. Above 60,000 of this devoted people were transported from the city to the camp and fleet, exchanged or sold according to the caprice of interest of their masters, and dispersed in remote servitude through the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Among these we may notice some remarkable characters. The historian Franza, first chamberlain and principal secretary, was involved with his family in the common lot. After suffering 4 months the hardships of slavery, he recovered his freedom. In the ensuing winter, he ventured to Adrianople and ransomed his wife from the Mir Bashi, or master of the horse. But his 2 children, in the flower of youth and beauty, had been seized for the use of Mohammed himself. The daughter of Franza died in the seraglio, perhaps a virgin. His son, in the 15th year of his age, preferred death to infamy, and was stabbed by the hand of the royal lover. A deed thus inhuman cannot surely be expiated by the taste and liberality with which he released a Grecian matron and her 2 daughters, on receiving a Latin ode from Philelphus, who had chosen a wife in that noble family. The pride or cruelty of Mohammed would have been most sensibly gratified by the capture of a Roman legate, but the dexterity of Cardinal Isidore eluded the search, and he escaped from Galata in a plebeian habit. In the fall and the sack of great cities, an historian is condemned to repeat the tale of uniform calamity. The same effects must be produced by the same passions, and when those passions may be indulged without control, small, alas, is the difference between civilized and savage man. Amidst the vague exclamations of bigotry and hatred, the Turks are not accused of a wanton or immoderate effusion of Christian blood. But according to their maxims, the maxims of antiquity, the lives of the vanquished were forfeited, and the legitimate reward of the conqueror was derived from the service, the sale, or the ransom of his captives of both sexes. The wealth of Constantinople had been granted by the Sultan to his victorious troops, and the rapine of an hour is more productive than the industry of years. But as no regular division was attempted of the spoil, the respective shares were not determined by merit, and the rewards of valour were stolen away by the followers of the camp, who had declined the toil and danger of the battle. The narrative of their depredations could not afford either amusement or instruction. The total amount in the last poverty of the empire has been valued at 4 millions of ducats, and of this sum a small part was the property of the Venetians, the Genoese, the Florentines, and the merchants of Ancona. Of these foreigners, the stock was improved in quick and perpetual circulation. But the riches of the Greeks were displayed in the idle ostentation of palaces and wardrobes, or deeply buried in treasures of ingots and old coin, lest it should be demanded at their hands for the defence of their country. The profanation and plunder of the monasteries and churches excited the most tragic complaints. The dome of St. Sophia itself, the earthly heaven, the second firmament, the vehicle of the cherubim, the throne of the glory of God, was despoiled of the oblations of ages. And the gold and silver, the pearls and jewels, the vases and sacerdotal ornaments were most wickedly converted to the service of mankind. After the divine images had been stripped of all that could be valuable to a profane eye, the canvas or the wood was torn or broken or burnt, or trod underfoot, or applied in the stables or the kitchen to the vilest uses. The example of sacrilege was imitated, however, from the Latin conquerors of Constantinople, and the treatment which Christ, the Virgin, and the saints has sustained from the guilty Catholic might be inflicted by the zealous Mussulman on the monuments of idolatry. Perhaps instead of joining the public clamour, a philosopher will observe that in the decline of the arts, the workmanship could not be more valuable than the work, and that a fresh supply of visions and miracles would speedily be renewed by the craft of the priest and the credulity of the people. He will more seriously deplore the loss of the Byzantine libraries, which were destroyed or scattered in the general confusion. 120,000 manuscripts are said to have disappeared. 10 volumes might be purchased for a single ducat, and the same ignominious price, too high perhaps for a shelf of theology, included the whole works of Aristotle and Homer, the noblest productions of the science and literature of ancient Greece. We may reflect with pleasure that an inestimable portion of our classic treasures was safely deposited in Italy, and that the mechanics of a German town had invented an art which derides the havoc of time and barbarism. From the first hour of the memorable 29th of May, disorder and rapine prevailed in Constantinople till the 8th hour of the same day, when the Sultan himself passed in triumph through the gate of St. Romanus. He was attended by his viziers, bashaws, and guards, each of whom, says a Byzantine historian, was robust as Hercules, dexterous as Apollo, and equal in battle to any 10 of the race of ordinary mortals. The conqueror gazed with satisfaction and wonder on the strange though splendid appearance of the domes and palaces, so dissimilar from the style of Oriental architecture. In the Hippodrome, or at Maidan, his eye was attracted by the twisted column of the 3 serpents, and as a trial of his strength, he shattered with his iron mace or battle-axe the underjaw of one of these monsters, which in the eyes of the Turks were the idols or talismans of the city. At the principal door of St. Sophia, he alighted from his horse and entered the dome. And such was his jealous regard for that monument of his glory, that on observing a zealous Mussulman in the act of breaking the marble pavement, he admonished him with his scimitar that, if the spoil and captives were granted to the soldiers, the public and private buildings had been reserved for the prince. By his command, the metropolis of the Eastern Church was transformed into a mosque. The rich and portable instruments of superstition had been removed. The crosses were thrown down, and the walls, which were covered with images and mosaics, were washed and purified, and restored to a state of naked simplicity. On the same day, or on the ensuing Friday, the muezzin or crier ascended the most lofty turret and proclaimed the ezan, or public invitation, in the name of God and his Prophet. The imam preached, and Mohammed II performed the namaz of prayer and thanksgiving on the great altar, where the Christian mysteries had so lately been celebrated before the last of the Caesars. From St. Sophia he proceeded to the august but desolate mansion of 100 successors of the great Constantine, but which in a few hours had been stripped of the pomp of royalty. A melancholy reflection on the vicissitudes of human greatness forced itself on his mind, and he repeated an elegant distich of Persian poetry. The spider has wove his web in the imperial palace, and the owl hath sung her watch-song on the towers of Afrasiab. Yet his mind was not satisfied, nor did the victory seem complete, till he was informed of the fate of Constantine, whether he had escaped, or been made prisoner, or had fallen in the battle. 2 Janissaries claimed the honour and reward of his death. The body, under a heap of slain, was discovered by the golden eagles embroidered on his shoes. The Greeks acknowledged with tears the head of their late emperor, and after exposing the bloody trophy, Mohammed bestowed on his rival the honours of a decent funeral. After his decease, Lucas Notaras, Great Duke and First Minister of the Empire, was the most important prisoner. When he offered his person and his treasures at the foot of the throne, "And why," said the indignant Sultan, "did you not employ these treasures in the defence of your prince and country?" "They are yours," answered the slave. "God had reserved them for your hands." "If he reserved them for me," replied the despot, "how have you presumed to withhold them for so long by a fruitless and fatal resistance?" The great duke alleged the obstinacy of the strangers, and some secret encouragement from the Turkish vizier. And from this perilous interview he was at length dismissed with the assurance of pardon and protection. Mohammed condescended to visit his wife, a venerable princess oppressed with sickness and grief, and his consolation for her misfortunes was in the most tender strain of humanity and filial reverence. A similar clemency was extended to the principal officers of state, of whom several were ransomed at his expense, and during some days he declared himself the friend and father of the vanquished people. But the scene was soon changed, and before his departure the hippodrome streamed with the blood of his noblest captives. His perfidious cruelty is execrated by the Christians. They adorn with the colours of heroic martyrdom the execution of the great duke and his 2 sons, and his death is ascribed to the generous refusal of delivering his children to the tyrant's lust. Yet a Byzantine historian has dropped an unguarded word of conspiracy, deliverance, and Italian succour. Such treason may be glorious, but the rebel who bravely ventures has justly forfeited his life. Nor should we blame a conqueror for destroying the enemies whom he can no longer trust. On the 18th of June, the victorious Sultan returned to Adrianople and smiled at the base and hollow embassies of the Christian princes who viewed their approaching ruin in the fall of the Eastern Empire. Constantinople had been left naked and desolate, without a prince or a people. But she could not be despoiled of the incomparable situation which marks her for the metropolis of a great empire. And the genius of the place will ever triumph over the accidents of time and fortune. Bursa and Adrianople, the ancient seats of the Ottomans, sunk into provincial towns, and Mohammed II established his own residence and that of his successors on the same commanding spot which had been chosen by Constantine. The fortifications of Galata, which might afford a shelter to the Latins, were prudently destroyed. But the damage of the Turkish cannon was soon repaired, and before the month of August, great quantities of lime had been burnt for the restoration of the walls of the capital. As the entire property of the soil and buildings, whether public or private, or profane or sacred, was now transferred to the conqueror, he first separated a space of 8 furlongs from the point of the triangle for the establishment of his seraglio, or palace. It is here, in the bosom of luxury, that the Grand Signor, as he has been emphatically named by the Italians, appears to reign over Europe and Asia. But his person on the shores of the Bosphorus may not always be secure from the insults of a hostile navy. In the new character of a mosque, the Cathedral of St. Sophia was endowed with an ample revenue, crowned with lofty minarets, and surrounded with groves and fountains for the devotion and refreshment of the Moslems. The same model was imitated in the Jami, or royal mosques, and the first of these was built by Mohammed himself on the ruins of the Church of the Holy Apostles and the tombs of the Greek emperors. On the third day after the conquest, the grave of Abu Ayyub, or Job, who had fallen in the first siege of the Arabs, was revealed in a vision. And it is before the sepulchre of the martyr that the new sultans are girded with the sword of empire. Constantinople no longer appertains to the Roman historian, nor shall I enumerate the civil and religious edifices that were profaned or erected by its Turkish masters. The population was speedily renewed, and before the end of September, 5,000 families of Anatolia and Romania had obeyed the royal mandate, which enjoined them, under pain of death, to occupy their new habitations in the capital. The throne of Mohammed was guarded by the numbers and fidelity of his Moslem subjects, but his rational policy aspired to collect the remnant of the Greeks, and they returned in crowds as soon as they were assured of their lives, their liberties, and the free exercise of their religion. In the election and investiture of a patriarch, the ceremonial of the Byzantine court was revived and imitated. With a mixture of satisfaction and horror, they beheld the Sultan on his throne, who delivered into the hands of Gennadius the crozier or pastoral staff, the symbol of his ecclesiastical office, who conducted the patriarch to the gate of the seraglio, presented him with a horse richly caparisoned, and directed the viziers and bashors to lead him to the palace which had been allotted for his residence. The churches of Constantinople were shared between the two religions. Their limits were marked, and till it was infringed by Selim, the grandson of Mohammed, the Greeks enjoyed above 60 years the benefit of this equal partition. Encouraged by the ministers of the Divan, who wished to elude the fanaticism of the Sultan, the Christian advocates presumed to allege that this division had been an act not of generosity, but of justice, not a concession, but a compact, and that if one half of the city had been taken by storm, the other moiety had surrendered on the faith of a sacred capitulation. The original grant had indeed been consumed by fire, but the loss was supplied by the testimony of 3 aged Janissaries who remembered the transaction, and their venal oaths are of more weight in the opinion of Cantemir than the positive and unanimous consent of the history of the times. The importance of Constantinople was felt and magnified in its loss. The pontificate of Nicholas V, however peaceful and prosperous, was dishonoured by the fall of the Eastern Empire, and the grief and terror of the Latins revived, or seemed to revive, the old enthusiasm of the Crusades. In one of the most distant countries of the West, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, entertained at Lille in Flanders an assembly of his nobles, and the pompous pageants of the feast were skilfully adapted to their fancy and feelings. In the midst of the banquet, a gigantic Saracen entered the hall, leading a fictitious elephant with a castle on his back. A matron in a mourning robe, the symbol of religion, was seen to issue from the castle. She deplored her oppression and accused the slowness of her champions. The principal herald of the Golden Fleece advanced, bearing on his fist a live pheasant, which, according to the rites of chivalry, he presented to the Duke. At this extraordinary summons, Philip, a wise and aged prince, engaged his personal powers in the holy war against the Turks. His example was imitated by the barons and knights of the assembly. They swore to God, the Virgin, the ladies, and the pheasant, and their particular vows were not less extravagant than the general sanction of their oath. But the performance was made to depend on some future and foreign contingency, and during 12 years, till the last hour of his life, the Duke of Burgundy might be scrupulously, and perhaps sincerely, on the eve of his departure. Had every breast glowed with the same ardour, had the union of the Christians corresponded with their bravery, had every country from Sweden to Naples supplied a just proportion of cavalry and infantry, of men and money, it is indeed probable that Constantinople would have been delivered, and that the Turks might have been chased beyond the Hellespont or the Euphrates. But the secretary of the emperor, who composed every epistle and attended every meeting, Aeneas Sylvius, a statesman and orator, describes from his own experience the repugnant state and spirit of Christendom. "It is a body," says he, "without a head, a republic without laws of magistrates. The Pope and the Emperor may shine as lofty titles, as splendid images, but they are unable to command, and none are willing to obey. Every state has a separate prince, and every prince has a separate interest. What eloquence could unite so many discordant and hostile powers under the same standard? Could they be assembled in arms? Who would dare to assume the office of general? What order could be maintained? What military discipline? Who would undertake to feed such an enormous multitude? Who would understand their various languages, or direct their stranger and incompatible manners? What mortal could reconcile the English with the French, Genoa with Aragon, the Germans with the natives of Hungary and Bohemia? If a small number enlisted in the Holy War, they must be overthrown by the infidels, if many, by their own weight and confusion." Yet the same Aeneas, when he was raised to the papal throne under the name of Pius II, devoted his life to the prosecution of the Turkish war. In the Council of Mantua, he excited some sparks of a false or feeble enthusiasm, and when the pontiff appeared at Ancona to embark in person with the troops, engagements vanished in excuses. A precise day was adjourned to an indefinite term, and his effective army consisted of some German pilgrims whom he was obliged to disband with indulgences and alms. Regardless of futurity, his successors and the powers of Italy were involved in the schemes of present and domestic ambition, and the distance or proximity of each object determined in their eyes its apparent magnitude. A more enlarged view of their interest would have taught them to maintain a defensive and naval war against the common enemy, and the support of Skanderbeg and his brave Albanians might have prevented the subsequent invasion of the Kingdom of Naples. The siege and sack of Otranto by the Turks diffused a general consternation, and Pope Sixtus was preparing to fly beyond the Alps when the storm was instantly dispelled by the death of Mohammed II in the 51st year of his age. His lofty genius aspired to the conquest of Italy. He was possessed of a strong city and a capacious harbour, and the same reign might have been decorated with the trophies of the new and the ancient Rome.
One of the few lingering consequences of the split between the western and eastern halves of the Roman Empire was the lasting religious schism in the Christian Church. Gibbon, late in his narrative, traces the underlying factors in this divide.
In the course of the present history, the aversion of the Greeks for the Latins has been often visible and conspicuous. It was originally derived from the disdain of servitude, inflamed, after the time of Constantine, by the pride of equality or dominion, and finally exasperated by the preference which their rebellious subjects had given to the alliance of the Franks. In every age, the Greeks were proud of their superiority in profane and religious knowledge. They had first received the light of Christianity. They had pronounced the decrees of the 7 general councils. They alone possessed the language of scripture and philosophy. Nor should the barbarians, immersed in the darkness of the West, presume to argue on the high and mysterious questions of theological science. Those barbarians despised in their turn the restless and subtle levity of the Orientals, the authors of every heresy, and blessed their own simplicity, which was content to hold the tradition of the Apostolic Church. Yet in the 7th century the synods of Spain and afterwards of France improved or corrupted the Nicene Creed on the mysterious subject of the third person of the Trinity. In the long controversies of the East, the nature and generation of the Christ had been scrupulously defined, and the well-known relation of Father and Son seemed to convey a faint image to the human mind. The idea of birth was less analogous to the Holy Spirit, who instead of a divine gift or attribute was considered by the Catholics as a substance, a person, a God. He was not begotten, but in the Orthodox style he proceeded. Did he proceed from the Father alone, perhaps by the Son, or from the Father and the Son? The first of these opinions was asserted by the Greeks, the second by the Latins, and the addition to the Nicene Creed of the word filioque kindled the flame of discord between the Oriental and the Gallic churches. In the origin of the dispute, the Roman pontiffs affected a character of neutrality and moderation. They condemned the innovation, but they acquiesced in the sentiment of their transalpine brethren. They seemed desirous of casting a veil of silence and charity over the superfluous research. And in the correspondence of Charlemagne and Leo III, the Pope assumes the liberality of a statesman, and the prince descends to the passions and prejudices of a priest. But the orthodoxy of Rome spontaneously obeyed the impulse of her temporal policy, and the filioque, which Leo wished to erase, was transcribed in the symbol and chanted in the liturgy of the Vatican. The Nicene and Athanasian creeds are held as the Catholic faith, without which none can be saved. And both Papists and Protestants must now sustain and return the anathemas of the Greeks, who deny the procession of the Holy Ghost from the Son as well as from the Father. Such articles of faith are not susceptible of treaty, but the rules of discipline will vary in remote and independent churches, and the reason even of divines might allow that the difference is inevitable and harmless. The craft or superstition of Rome has imposed on her priests and deacons the rigid obligation of celibacy. Among the Greeks it is confined to the bishops. The loss is compensated by dignity or annihilated by age, and the parochial clergy, the papas, enjoy the conjugal society of the wives whom they have married before their entrance into holy orders. A question concerning the azims was fiercely debated in the 11th century, and the essence of the Eucharist was supposed in the East and West to depend on the use of leavened or unleavened bread. Shall I mention in a serious history the furious reproaches that were urged against the Latins, who for a long while remained on the defensive? They neglected to abstain, according to the apostolical decree, from things strangled and from blood. They fasted, a Jewish observance, on the Saturday of each week. During the first week of Lent, they permitted the use of milk and cheese. Their infirm monks were indulged in the taste of flesh, and animal grease was substituted for the want of vegetable oil. The whole chrism or unction in baptism was reserved to the episcopal order. The bishops, as the bridegrooms of their churches, were decorated with rings. Their priests shaved their faces and baptized by a single immersion. Such were the crimes which provoked the zeal of the patriarchs of Constantinople, and which were justified with equal zeal by the doctors of the Latin Church. Bigotry and national aversion are powerful magnifiers of every object of dispute. But the immediate cause of the schism of the Greeks may be traced in the emulation of the leading prelates, who maintained the supremacy of the old metropolis, superior to all, and of the reigning capital, inferior to none, in the Christian world. About the middle of the 9th century, Photius, an ambitious layman, the captain of the guards and principal secretary, was promoted by merit and favour to the more desirable office of Patriarch of Constantinople. In science, even ecclesiastical science, he surpassed the clergy of the age, and the purity of his morals has never been impeached. But his ordination was hasty, his rise was irregular, and Ignatius, his abdicated predecessor, was yet supported by the public compassion and the obstinacy of his adherents. They appealed to the tribunal of Nicholas I, one of the proudest and most aspiring of the Roman pontiffs, who embraced the welcome opportunity of judging and condemning his rival of the East. Their quarrel was embittered by a conflict of jurisdiction over the king and nation of the Bulgarians, nor was their recent conversion to Christianity of much avail to either prelate, unless he could number the proselytes among the subjects of his power. With the aid of his court, the Greek patriarch was victorious. But in the furious contest, he deposed in his turn the successor of St. Peter, and involved the Latin Church in the reproach of heresy and schism. Photius sacrificed the peace of the world to a short and precarious reign. He fell with his patron, the Caesar Bardas. And Basil the Macedonian performed an act of justice in the restoration of Ignatius, whose age and dignity had not been sufficiently respected. From his monastery or prison, Photius solicited the favour of the emperor by pathetic complaints and artful flattery, and the eyes of his rival were scarcely closed when he was again restored to the throne of Constantinople. After the death of Basil, he experienced the vicissitudes of courts and the ingratitude of a royal pupil. The patriarch was again deposed, and in his last solitary hours he might regret the freedom of a secular and studious life. In each revolution, the breath, the nod of the sovereign had been accepted by a submissive clergy, and a synod of 300 bishops was always prepared to hail the triumph or to stigmatize the fall of the holy or the execrable Photius. By a delusive promise of succour or reward, the popes were tempted to countenance these various proceedings, and the synods of Constantinople were ratified by their epistles or legates. But the court and the people, Ignatius and Photius, were equally adverse to their claims. Their ministers were insulted or imprisoned. The procession of the Holy Ghost was forgotten. Bulgaria was forever annexed to the Byzantine throne, and the schism was prolonged by their rigid censure of all the multiplied ordinations of an irregular patriarch. The darkness and corruption of the 10th century suspended the intercourse, without reconciling the minds of the two nations. But when the Norman sword restored the churches of Apulia to the jurisdiction of Rome, the departing flock was warned by a petulant epistle of the Greek patriarch to avoid and abhor the errors of the Latins. The rising majesty of Rome could no longer brook the insolence of a rebel, and Michael Cerularius was excommunicated in the heart of Constantinople by the Pope's legates. Shaking the dust from their feet, they deposited on the altar of St. Sophia a direful anathema, which enumerates the 7 mortal heresies of the Greeks, and devotes the guilty teachers and their unhappy sectaries to the eternal society of the devil and his angels. According to the emergencies of the Church and State, a friendly correspondence was sometimes resumed. The language of charity and concord was sometimes affected. But the Greeks have never recanted their errors, the popes have never repealed their sentence, and from this thunderbolt we may date the consummation of the schism. It was enlarged by each ambitious step of the Roman pontiffs. The emperors blushed and trembled at the ignominious fate of their royal brethren of Germany, and the people was scandalized by the temporal power and military life of the Latin clergy. The aversion of the Greeks and Latins was nourished and manifested in the 3 first expeditions to the Holy Land. Alexius Comnenus contrived the absence at least of the formidable pilgrims. His successors, Manuel and Isaac Angelus, conspired with the Moslems for the ruin of the greatest princes of the Franks, and their crooked and malignant policy was seconded by the active and voluntary obedience of every order of their subjects. Of this hostile temper, a large portion may doubtless be ascribed to the difference of language, dress, and manners which severs and alienates the nations of the globe. The pride as well as the prudence of the sovereign was deeply wounded by the intrusion of foreign armies that claimed a right of traversing his dominions and passing under the walls of his capital. His subjects were insulted and plundered by the rude strangers of the West, and the hatred of the pusillanimous Greeks was sharpened by secret envy of the bold and pious enterprises of the Franks. But these profane causes of national enmity were fortified and inflamed by the venom of religious zeal. Instead of a kind embrace and hospitable reception from their Christian brethren of the East, Every tongue was taught to repeat the names of schismatic and heretic, more odious to an orthodox ear than those of pagan and infidel. Instead of being loved for the general conformity of faith and worship, they were abhorred for some rules of discipline, some questions of theology, in which themselves or their teachers might differ from the Oriental Church. In the crusade of Louis VII, the Greek clergy washed and purified the altars which had been defiled by the sacrifice of a French priest. The companions of Frederick Barbarossa deplore the injuries which they endured, both in word and deed, from the peculiar rancour of the bishops and monks. Their prayers and sermons excited the people against the impious barbarians, and the Patriarch is accused of declaring that the faithful might obtain the redemption of all their sins by the extirpation of the schismatics. An enthusiast named Dorotheus alarmed the fears and restored the confidence of the emperor by a prophetic assurance that the German heretic, after assaulting the gate of Blachines, would be made a signal example of the divine vengeance. The passage of these mighty armies were rare and perilous events, but the Crusades introduced a frequent and familiar intercourse between the two nations, which enlarged their knowledge without abating their prejudices. The wealth and luxury of Constantinople demanded the productions of every climate. These imports were balanced by the art and labour of her numerous inhabitants. Her situation invites the commerce of the world, and in every period of her existence that commerce has been in the hands of foreigners. After the decline of Amalfi, the Venetians, Pisans, and Genoese introduced their factories and settlements into the capital of the empire. Their services were rewarded with honours and immunities. They acquired the possession of lands and houses. Their families were multiplied by marriages with the natives, and after the toleration of a Mohammedan mosque, it was impossible to interdict the churches of the Roman Rite. The two wives of Manuel Comnenus were of the race of the Franks. The first, a sister-in-law of the Emperor Conrad, the second, a daughter of the Prince of Antioch. He obtained for his son Alexius a daughter of Philip Augustus, King of France, and he bestowed his own daughter on a Marquis of Montferrat, who was educated and dignified in the palace of Constantinople. The Greek encountered the arms and aspired to the empire of the West. He esteemed the valour and trusted the fidelity of the Franks. Their military talents were unfitly recompensed by the lucrative offices of judges and treasurers. The policy of Manuel had solicited the alliance of the Pope, and the popular voice accused him of a partial bias to the nation and religion of the Latins. During his reign and that of his successor Alexius, they were exposed at Constantinople to the reproach of foreigners, heretics, and favourites, and this triple guilt was severely expiated in the tumult which announced the return and elevation of Andronicus. The people rose in arms. From the Asiatic shore the tyrant dispatched his troops and galleys to assist the national revenge, and the hopeless resistance of the strangers served only to justify the rage and sharpen the daggers of the assassins. Neither age, nor sex, nor the ties of friendship or kindred could save the victims of national hatred and avarice and religious zeal. The Latins were slaughtered in their houses and in the streets. Their quarter was reduced to ashes. The clergy were burnt in their churches, and the sick in their hospitals. And some estimate may be formed of the slain from the clemency which sold above 4,000 Christians in perpetual slavery to the Turks. The priests and monks were the loudest and most active in the destruction of the schismatics, and they chanted a thanksgiving to the Lord when the head of a Roman cardinal, the Pope's legate, was severed from his body, fastened to the tail of a dog, and dragged with savage mockery through the city. The more diligent of the strangers had retreated on the first alarm to their vessels and escaped through the Hellespont from the scene of blood. In their flight, they burnt and ravaged 200 miles of the seacoast, inflicted a severe revenge on the guiltless subjects of the empire, marked the priests and monks as their peculiar enemies, and compensated, by the accumulation of plunder, the loss of their property and friends. On their return, they exposed to Italy and Europe the wealth and weakness, the perfidy and malice of the Greeks, whose vices were painted as the genuine characters of heresy and schism. The scruples of the first Crusaders had neglected the fairest opportunities of securing, by the possession of Constantinople, the way to the Holy Land. A domestic revolution invited and almost compelled the French and Venetians to achieve the conquest of the Roman Empire of the East. In the last days of Pope Eugenius IV, two of his servants, the learned Poggius and a friend, ascended the Capitoline Hill, reposed themselves among the ruins of columns and temples, and viewed from that commanding spot the wide and various prospect of desolation. The place and the object gave ample scope for moralizing on the vicissitudes of fortune, which spares neither man nor the proudest of his works, which buries empires and cities in a common grave. And it was agreed that in proportion to her former greatness, the fall of Rome was the more awful and deplorable. Her primeval state, such as she might appear in a remote age, when Evander entertained the stranger of Troy, has been delineated by the fancy of Virgil. This Tarpeian rock was then a savage and solitary thicket. In the time of the poet, it was crowned with the golden roofs of a temple. The temple is overthrown. The gold has been pillaged. The wheel of fortune has accomplished her revolution, and the sacred ground is again disfigured with thorns and brambles. The hill of the Capitol, on which we sit, was formerly the head of the Roman Empire, the citadel of the earth, the terror of kings. Illustrated by the footsteps of so many triumphs, enriched with the spoils and tributes of so many nations. This spectacle of the world, how is it fallen? How changed, how defaced. The path of victory is obliterated by vines, and the benches of the senators are concealed by a dunghill. Cast your eyes on the Palatine Hill and seek among the shapeless and enormous fragments the marble theatre, the obelisks, the colossal statues, the porticos of Nero's palace. Survey the other hills of the city. The vacant space is interrupted only by ruins and gardens. The forum of the Roman people, where they assemble to enact their laws and elect their magistrates, is now enclosed for the cultivation of pot-herbs, or thrown open for the reception of swine and buffaloes. The public and private edifices that were founded for eternity lie prostrate, naked and broken, like the limbs of a mighty giant. And the ruin is the more visible from the stupendous relics that have survived the injuries of time and fortune. These relics are minutely described by Poggius, one of the first who raised his eyes from the monuments of legendary to those of classic superstition. 1. Besides a bridge, an arch, a sepulchre, and the pyramid of Cestius, he could discern, of the age of the Republic, a double row of vaults in the salt office of the Capitol, which were inscribed with the name and munificence of Catullus. 2. 11 temples were visible in some degree, from the perfect form of the Pantheon to the 3 arches and a marble column of the Temple of Peace, which Vespasian erected after the civil wars and the Jewish triumph. 3. Of the number, which he rashly defines, of 7 thermae, or public baths, none were sufficiently entire to represent the use and distribution of the several parts. But those of Diocletian and Antoninus Caracalla still retained the titles of the founders, and astonished the curious spectator who, in observing their solidity and extent, the variety of marbles, the size and multitude of the columns, compared the labour and expense with the use and importance. Of the baths of Constantine, of Alexander, of Domitian, or rather of Titus, some vestige might yet be found. 4. The triumphal arches of Titus, Severus, and Constantine were entire, both the structure and the inscriptions. A falling fragment was honoured with the name of Trajan, and 2 arches, then extant in the Flaminian Way, have been ascribed to the base memory of Faustina and Gallienus. 5. After the wonder of the Colosseum, Poggius might have overlooked a small amphitheatre of brick, most probably for the use of the Praetorian camp. The theatres of Marcellus and Pompey were occupied in a great measure by public and private buildings, and in the Circus, Agonalis and Maximus, little more than the situation and the form could be investigated. 6. The columns of Trajan and Antonine were still erect, but the Egyptian obelisks were broken or buried. A people of gods and heroes, the workmanship of art was reduced to one equestrian figure of gilt brass, and to 5 marble statues, of which the most conspicuous were the 2 horses of Phidias and Praxiteles. 7. The 2 mausoleums or sepulchres of Augustus and Hadrian could not totally be lost, but the former was only visible as a mound of earth, and the latter, the castle of St. Angelo, had acquired the name and appearance of a modern fortress. With the addition of some separate and nameless columns, such were the remains of the ancient city. For the marks of a more recent structure might be detected in the walls, which formed a circumference of 10 miles, included 379 turrets, and opened into the country by 13 gates. This melancholy picture was drawn above 900 years after the fall of the Western Empire, and even of the Gothic kingdom of Italy. A long period of distress and anarchy in which empire and arts and riches had migrated from the banks of the Tiber was incapable of restoring or adorning the city. And as all that is human must retrograde if it do not advance, every successive age must have hastened the ruin of the works of antiquity. After a diligent inquiry, I can discern 4 principal causes of the ruin of Rome, which continue to operate in a period of more than 1,000 years. 1. The injuries of time and nature. 2. The hostile attacks of the barbarians and Christians. 3. The use and abuse of the materials. And 4. The domestic quarrels of the Romans. 1. The art of man is able to construct monuments far more permanent than the narrow span of his own existence. Yet these monuments, like himself, are perishable and frail. And in the boundless annals of time, his life and his labours must equally be measured as a fleeting moment. Of a simple and solid edifice, it is not easy, however, to circumscribe the duration. As the wonders of ancient days, the pyramids attracted the curiosity of the ancients. 100 generations, the leaves of autumn, have dropped into the grave, and after the fall of the pharaohs and Ptolemies, the Caesars and Caliphs, the same pyramids stand erect and unshaken above the floods of the Nile. A complex figure of various and minute parts is more accessible to injury and decay, and the silent lapse of time is often accelerated by hurricanes and earthquakes, by fires and inundations. The air and earth have doubtless been shaken, and the lofty turrets of Rome have tottered from their foundations. But the 7 hills do not appear to be placed on the great cavities of the globe, nor has the city in any age been exposed to the convulsions of nature, which in the climate of Antioch, Lisbon, or Lima have crumbled in a few moments the works of ages into dust. Fire is the most powerful agent of life and death. The rapid mischief may be kindled and propagated by the industry or negligence of mankind, and every period of the Roman annals is marked by the repetition of similar calamities. A memorable conflagration, the guilt or misfortune of Nero's reign, continued, though with unequal fury, either 6 or 9 days. Innumerable buildings, crowded in close and crooked streets, supplied perpetual fuel for the flames, and when they ceased, 4 only of the 14 regions were left entire. 3 were totally destroyed, and 7 were deformed by the relics of smoking and lacerated edifices. The crowd of writers of every nation who impute the destruction of the Roman monuments to the Goths and the Christians have neglected to inquire how far they were animated by a hostile principle, and how far they possessed the means and the leisure to satiate their enmity. In the preceding volumes of this history, I have described the triumph of barbarism and religion, and I can only resume in a few words their real or imaginary connection with the ruin of ancient Rome. Our fancy may create or adopt a pleasing romance, that the Goths and Vandals sallied from Scandinavia, ardent to avenge the flight of Odin. to break the chains and to chastise the oppressors of mankind, that they wished to burn the records of classic literature and to found their national architecture on the broken members of the Tuscan and Corinthian orders. But in simple truth, the northern conquerors were neither sufficiently savage nor sufficiently refined to entertain such aspiring ideas of destruction and revenge. The shepherds of Scythia and Germany had been educated in the armies of the empire, whose discipline they acquired and whose weakness they invaded. With the familiar use of the Latin tongue, they had learned to reverence the name and titles of Rome, and though incapable of emulating, they were more inclined to admire than to abolish the arts and studies of a brighter period. In the transient possession of a rich and unresisting capital, the soldiers of Alaric and Genseric were stimulated by the passions of a victorious army. Amidst the wanton indulgence of lust or cruelty, portable wealth was the object of their search. Nor could they derive either pride or pleasure from the unprofitable reflection that they had battered to the ground the works of the consuls and Caesars. Their moments were indeed precious. The Goths evacuated Rome on the 6th, the Vandals on the 15th day, and though it be far more difficult to build than to destroy, their hasty assault would have made a slight impression on the solid piles of antiquity. We may remember that both Alaric and Genseric affected to spare the buildings of the city, that they subsisted in strength and beauty under the auspicious government of Theodoric, and that the momentary resentment of Totila was disarmed by his own temper and the advice of his friends and enemies. From these innocent barbarians, the reproach may be transferred to the Catholics of Rome. The statues, altars, and houses of the demons were an abomination in their eyes, and in the absolute command of the city, they might labor with zeal and perseverance to erase the idolatry of their ancestors. The demolition of the temples in the East affords to them an example of conduct, and to us an argument of belief. And it is probable that a portion of guilt or merit may be imputed with justice to the Roman proselytes. 3. The value of any object that supplies the wants or pleasures of mankind is compounded of its substance and its form, of the materials and the manufacture. Its price must depend on the number of persons by whom it may be acquired and used, on the extent of the market, and consequently on the ease or difficulty of remote exportation, according to the nature of the commodity, its local situation, and the temporary circumstances of the world. The barbarian conquerors of Rome usurped in a moment the toil and treasure of successive ages. But except the luxuries of immediate consumption, they must view without desire all that could not be removed from the city in the Gothic wagons or the fleet of the Vandals. Gold and silver were the first objects of their avarice. As in every country and in the smallest compass, they represent the most ample command of the industry and possessions of mankind. A vase or a statue of those precious metals might tempt the vanity of some barbarian chief. But the grosser multitude, regardless of the form, was tenacious only of the substance, and the melted ingots might be readily divided and stamped into the current coin of the empire. The less active or less fortunate robbers were reduced to the baser plunder of brass, lead, iron, and copper. Whatever had escaped the Goths and Vandals was pillaged by the Greek tyrants, and the Emperor Constans, in his rapacious visit, stripped the bronze tiles from the roof of the Pantheon. The edifices of Rome might be considered as a vast and various mine. The first labor of extracting the materials was already performed. The metals were purified and cast. The marbles were hewn and polished, and after foreign and domestic rapine had been satiated, the remains of the city, could a purchaser have been found, were still venal. The monuments of antiquity had been left naked of their precious ornaments, but the Romans would demolish with their own hands the arches and walls, if the hope of profit could surpass the cost of the labor and exportation. 4. I have reserved for the last the most potent and forcible cause of destruction, the domestic hostilities of the Romans themselves. Under the dominion of the Greek and French emperors, the peace of the city was disturbed by accidental, though frequent, seditions. It is from the decline of the latter, from the beginning of the 10th century, that we may date the licentiousness of private war, which violated with impunity the laws of the Code and the Gospel, without respecting the majesty of the absent sovereign or the presence and person of the Vicar of Christ. In a dark period of 500 years, Rome was perpetually afflicted by the sanguinary quarrels of the nobles and the people. And if much has escaped the knowledge, and much is unworthy of the notice of history, I have exposed in the 2 preceding chapters the causes and effects of the public disorders. At such a time, when every quarrel was decided by the sword, and none could trust their lives or properties to the impotence of law, the powerful citizens were armed for safety or offence against the domestic enemies whom they feared or hated. Except Venice alone, the same dangers and designs were common to all the free republics of Italy, and the nobles usurped the prerogative of fortifying their houses and erecting strong towers that were capable of resisting a sudden attack. The cities were filled with these hostile edifices, and the example of Lucca, which contained 300 towers, her law, which confined their height to the measure of 80 feet, may be extended with suitable latitude to the more opulent and populous states. The first step of the senator Brancaleone in the establishment of peace and justice was to demolish, as we have already seen, 140 of the towers of Rome, and in the last days of anarchy and discord, as late as the reign of Martin V, 44 still stood in one of the 13 or 14 regions of the city. To this mischievous purpose, the remains of antiquity were most readily adapted. The temples and arches afforded a broad and solid basis for the new structures of brick and stone, and we can name the modern turrets that were raised on the triumphal monuments of Julius Caesar, Titus, and the Antonines. Even the churches were encompassed with arms and bulwarks, and the military engines on the roof of St. Peter's were the terror of the Vatican and the scandal of the Christian world. Whatever is fortified will be attacked, and whatever is attacked may be destroyed. Could the Romans have wrested from the popes the castle of St. Angelo, they had resolved by a public decree to annihilate that monument of servitude. Every building of defence was exposed to a siege, and in every siege the arts and engines of destruction were laboriously employed. After the death of Nicholas IV, Rome, without a sovereign or a senate, was abandoned 6 months to the fury of civil war. The houses, says a cardinal and poet of the times, were crushed by the weight and velocity of enormous stones. The walls were perforated by the strokes of the battering ram, the towers were involved in fire and smoke, and the assailants were stimulated by rapine and revenge. The work was consummated by the tyranny of the laws, and the factions of Italy alternately exercised a blind and thoughtless vengeance on their adversaries, whose houses and castles they razed to the ground. The improvements of Rome since the 15th century have not been the spontaneous produce of freedom and industry. The first and most natural root of a great city is the labour and populousness of the adjacent country, which supplies the materials of subsistence, of manufactures, and of foreign trade. But the greater part of the Campagna of Rome is reduced to a dreary and desolate wilderness. The overgrown estates of the princes and the clergy are cultivated by the lazy hands of indigent and hopeless vassals, and the scanty harvests are confined or exported for the benefit of a monopoly. A second and more artificial cause of the growth of a metropolis is the residence of a monarch, the expense of a luxurious court, and the tributes of dependent provinces. Those provinces and tributes had been lost in the fall of the empire, and if some streams of the silver of Peru and the gold of Brazil have been attracted by the Vatican, the revenues of the cardinals, the fees of office, the oblations of pilgrims and clients, and the remnant of ecclesiastical taxes afford a poor and precarious supply, which maintains, however, the idleness of the court and city. The population of Rome, far below the measure of the great capitals of Europe, does not exceed 170,000 inhabitants, and within the spacious enclosure of the walls, the largest portion of the 7 hills is overspread with vineyards and ruins. The beauty and splendour of the modern city may be ascribed to the abuses of the government, to the influence of superstition. Each reign, the exceptions are rare, has been marked by the rapid elevation of a new family, enriched by the childless pontiff at the expense of the church and country. The palaces of these fortunate nephews are the most costly monuments of elegance and servitude. The perfect arts of architecture, painting, and sculpture have been prostituted in their service, and their galleries and gardens are decorated with the most precious works of antiquity, which taste or vanity has prompted them to collect. The ecclesiastical revenues were more decently employed by the popes themselves in the pomp of the Catholic worship. But it is superfluous to enumerate their pious foundations of altars, chapels, and churches, since these lesser stars are eclipsed by the sun of the Vatican, by the dome of St. Peter, the most glorious structure that ever has been applied to the use of religion. The fame of Julius II, Leo X, and Sixtus V is accompanied by the superior merit of Bramante and Fontana, of Raphael and Michelangelo, and the same munificence which had been displayed in palaces and temples was directed with equal zeal to revive and emulate the labours of antiquity. Prostrate obelisks were raised from the ground and erected in the most conspicuous places. Of the 11 aqueducts of the Caesars and consuls, 3 were restored. The artificial rivers were conducted over a long series of old or of new arches to discharge into marble basins a flood of salubrious and refreshing waters. And the spectator, impatient to ascend the steps of St. Peter's, is detained by a column of Egyptian granite, which rises between 2 lofty and perpetual fountains to the height of 120 feet. The map, the description, the monuments of ancient Rome have been elucidated by the diligence of the antiquarian and the student. And the footsteps of heroes, the relics not of superstition but of empire, are devoutly visited by a new race of pilgrims from the remote and once savage countries of the north. Of these pilgrims, and of every reader, the attention will be excited by a history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the greatest, perhaps, and most awful scene in the history of mankind. The various causes and progressive effects are connected with many of the events most interesting in human annals. The artful policy of the Caesars, who long maintained the name and image of a free republic. The disorders of military despotism. The rise, establishment, and sects of Christianity. The foundation of Constantinople. The division of the monarchy. The invasion and settlements of the barbarians of Germany and Scythia. The institutions of the civil law. The crusades of the Latins in the East. The conquests of the Saracens and Turks, the ruin of the Greek Empire. The historian may applaud the importance and variety of his subject, but while he is conscious of his own imperfections, he must often accuse the deficiency of his materials. It was among the ruins of the Capitol that I first conceived the idea of a work which has amused and exercised near 20 years of my life, and which, however inadequate to my own wishes, I finally deliver to the curiosity and candor of the public.